Well, we're here in part 2 of lessons from the Mueller report. And so I'm wondering how we're going to learn those lessons. During part 1 of lessons of the Mueller report, we brought in John Dean to re-examine the Nixon impeachment. Perhaps during part 2, we'll get to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Well, maybe the folks here could teach us some lessons for the witnesses so that we don't have to individually go through. Here's the question. And raise your hand if you would answer this in the affirmative. Do any witnesses here have personal knowledge regarding the truth or falsity of a single material fact in the Mueller report? If you have personal knowledge regarding the truth or falsity of a single material fact, just raise your hand so I can figure out who to ask the question to. So the record can reflect no witnesses have raised their hand. No witnesses have any personal knowledge regarding a single fact in the report. No witnesses last week had personal knowledge.
Will the gentleman yield? I take your point. Will the gentleman yield?
Would the gentleman yield?
Well, I'll certainly yield to the chairman because I'm eager to get to the lesson.
I would remind the gentleman that there is an ongoing controversy that the White House is asserting the right to prohibit the testimony of any witness with regard to anything that happened.
I'm going to reclaim my time. I fully understand and appreciate that, Mr. Chairman.
Will the gentleman yield to my...
I will not, because I want to respond to the chairman's assertion. The person over whom the White House can assert no privilege is Robert Mueller. And you have the power to subpoena Robert Mueller. You have used subpoena power extensively in this committee, and you won't subpoena the person who wrote the report. And so this hearing should not be entitled Lessons from the Mueller Report. It should be entitled Hot Takes from the Mueller Report, because what we're getting are people who have no knowledge of the facts, no information as to the underlying information. They're just reading it and offering their analysis and their hot takes. But I think that there's a far more critical issue that our committee should be addressing and that we could address. Right now we're at a circumstance where upwards of 5,500 people are arriving every day on our southern border. And this committee has the jurisdiction to reform our asylum laws, to secure the border, to make changes to ensure that we have a country that's protected and a rule of law that's maintained. Fortunately, actually, one of our witnesses is somewhat of an expert on this subject. Ms. Cordero, you are...
He's not in order.
Ms. Cordero, you are somewhat of an expert on the activities that go on our southern border, aren't you?
I do some work related to national security and homeland security in my capacity as a senior fellow, yes.
And in 2013 for Georgetown, you wrote an essay entitled Breaking the Mexican Cartels, a Key for Homeland Security Challenge.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'm going to interrupt and say that this hearing is about part 1 of the Mueller investigation.
I wish it was about the Mueller report. I really wish it was, Mr. Johnson. They won't know anything about the Mueller report.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman will proceed. The gentleman has the time.
You wrote, breaking the Mexican cartels is no easy feat, but is a necessary one to secure our southern border, eliminate the presence of dangerous cartels in our cities, reduce Americans' contribution to the drug trade and resulting violence, and play our role in restoring the Mexican citizenry to a free society from daily terror. Is it your impression that since you wrote this in 2013 that the circumstances on our southern border have gotten better or worse?
I will, excuse me, the gentleman will suspend. Since this does not reflect, this has nothing to do with part 1 or volume 1 or volume 2 of the Mueller report or anything conceivably,
Mr. Chairman,
or anything conceivably within the ambit of this, of this hearing or the notice of this hearing, the witness may or may not reply at his or her discretion.
I'm happy to respond, Congressman. When I wrote that report, I thought that it was an issue that needed attention. It was not at the beginning of the Obama administration something that I think did get sufficient attention. There clearly is a changed circumstance. We are in 2019 now. There is clearly a humanitarian problem on the southern border that needs to be addressed. What you will not find in that article is any mention of a wall as a response to that challenge, nor any encouragement of the use of emergency authorities to solve it.
I understand that, but you recognize the crisis, you recognize that it's worse, and I acknowledge that the wall may be something that divides us, but reforming our asylum laws, ensuring that we've got the supplemental appropriation in place to make sure people aren't dying on our border, and reducing the terror you write about is a lot more important than hearing from people that know nothing about the Mueller report, purport to give us lessons on the Mueller report.
The time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman, you guys take way more than your allocated time, and then you take my time and impose on it, and then restrict it. This is a total farce, and it's no wonder witnesses don't want to come here and testify to this committee. I yield back.
I'd be happy to come back and talk about Homeland Security at another time.
Mr. Secretary, why was Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeyer relieved of his command?
It was a decision made by his chain of command, and typically those decisions are made based upon either having confidence or a lack of confidence. This issue is under investigation by the IG, and so I won't comment any further on that.
In my previous discussions with service members and particularly officers, I would hear about complaints over parts not arriving on time, long deployments, and in my more recent discussions with those officers, the number one issue that they raised to me with concern, often unable to speak publicly for fear of the type of retribution that Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeyer faced, they say that your stand down regarding extremism did not help our military, it hurt the military. And I want to share with you that perspective, that it caused service members to otherize one another, it impaired group cohesion, and interesting to me is that I've heard those sentiments most frequently from units that are majority-minority, that this was not particularly helpful. So I wanted to give you the opportunity to maybe share with us more specificity regarding the definitions that seem to be a challenge when Ms. Hartzler was asking questions. How should the Department of Defense think about critical race theory?
Could I make a comment, Secretary? I'm sorry.
Well, I'm very limited on my time, General Milley.
Well, I just want to make a comment. The feedback
well, I know, but
I've
asked the question to Secretary Austin.
I don't know what the issue of critical race theory is and what the relevance here with the department. We do not teach critical race theory. We don't embrace critical race theory, and I think that's a spurious conversation. And so we are focused on extremist behaviors, and not ideology, not people's thoughts, not people's political orientation. Behaviors is what we're focused on. And one final point, and thanks for your anecdotal input, but I would say that I have gotten 10 times that amount of input, 50 times that amount of input on the other side that have said, hey, we're glad to have had the ability to have a conversation with ourselves and with our leadership. And that's what we need to make sure
again,
that we remain
reclaiming my
a
time,
cohesive
Mr. Secretary,
organization.
it may be that you're receiving that input in the ratios you describe because it was your directive. It may be that people are concerned about criticizing your decision because Lieutenant Colonel Lohmeyer was not relieved of his command for his actions. He was not relieved of his command because of poor performance regarding his duties. He was relieved of his command precisely because of his thoughts and because of his critique of critical race theory. It is particularly helpful that you have said that the Department of Defense does not embrace critical race theory and that you think the discussion is not appropriate. I would suggest that it is the ideology that is not appropriate, and it is particularly concerning to me that you have hired a critical race theorist to give you advice on personnel matters, and that person is Bishop Garrison. And I would particularly observe that on July 27, 2019, Bishop Garrison tweeted regarding former President Trump, he's dragging a lot of bad actors out into the sunlight, normalizing their actions. And here's the relevant part. If you support the president, you support that. There is no room for nuance in this. There is no more, but I'm not like that talk. And then he replies to his own tweet with what seems to be a very ethno-nationalist hashtag, hashtag Black44. Could you enlighten us as to what advice Mr. Garrison has given you, and are you concerned that while you testify publicly to our committee that the department doesn't embrace critical race theory, you have hired someone who is precisely a critical race theorist?
This is the first I've ever heard Mr. Garrison be described as a critical race theorist. So this is new. And, I'm sure
did you
that he
review his
would.
tweets before you hired him, personally?
Pardon me?
Did you review his tweets before you hired him?
I did not personally review his tweets.
I would just ask that maybe that be helpful. Is there anything you can share in just these final seconds regarding any advice he's given you?
Let me just share one other thing that you brought up, Congressman, about the input that comes to me. You know, I trust my leadership from top to bottom that they will give me fair and balanced and unvarnished input. And for you to say that people are telling me what I want to hear, I get it, but I'm smart enough to know
that does happen.
Yeah. You know, maybe they're telling you what you want to hear.
Well, I don't know that they even know what I want to hear.
Time has expired.
I'm from Colorado, Mr. Buck.
And with the chairman's permission, I defer to Mr. Gaetz from Florida.
Mr. Gaetz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is my favorite subcommittee in my half-decade in Congress, and in no small part because of the way you've led it. I am incredibly proud of the work we have done to address some of these anti-competitive practices of these monopolistic entities. And I was particularly persuaded by the testimony of Mr. Gross regarding how that market power of big businesses like Amazon can limit the ability of workers to have any type of meaningful negotiation. Congresswoman Jayapal led legislation that the chairman of the committee, the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Buck, and myself supported that would force the breakup of companies like Amazon into smaller entities. And I wanted Mr. Gross's perspective on that. Do you believe, as a negotiator, that would improve the position of workers to break up companies like Amazon and other big tech companies into smaller entities?
Well, I'm not an expert on this field. You know, obviously I'm just a driver at UPS and the shop steward for my union. But what I would say, though, is that it might not necessarily be necessary to break up the size of the company, but just to allow or force the company or encourage the company to employ the workers that it's utilizing. So instead of using third-party individuals and leaning on them and chewing them up and spitting them out, have real employees, you know, give them real wages, allow them to have a collective bargaining unit agreement. And I think that way you would get more productivity out of them in the long run and still be able to run a successful business.
I appreciate that perspective. My concern is that if they're able to stay so big, even if we used the awesome powers of the federal government to force these relationships out of independent contractor relationships into employment relationships, they're still so big that they could reduce the contributions of those employees with the strength that they have. And it is one of the reasons why we had bipartisan support on this committee for those bills. But, Mr. Chairman, I'm deeply disappointed that those bills haven't been called up for a vote. It seems a bit odd to be here talking about positive impacts of legislation the subcommittee has passed when the full House has had the opportunity in prior weeks to take up these bills and they haven't. And I have to wonder why that has happened. And so, Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a piece from the New York Times entitled "Tech Giants Fearful of Proposals to Curb Them, Blitz Washington with Lobbying."
Without objection.
And so that could be a reason, the power of lobbyists in this town to make things tougher for workers. I guess there could be other reasons, too. Mr. Chairman, I would seek to enter into the record a piece from Yahoo News entitled "Tim Cook Reportedly Called Pelosi to Deliver a Warning About Congress's Antitrust Bills."
Without objection.
So maybe it's the lobbyists, maybe it's the power of these very powerful CEOs making personal calls, but it could even be something more sinister. Mr. Chairman, I seek unanimous consent to enter into the record a Fortune.com piece entitled "Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Husband Cashed in on Big Tech just as Congress was set to pounce."
Without objection.
And in that article, there's discussion of the spouse of the Speaker of the House making a $6 million call on stocks that netted $5.3 million while we're not moving these bills. So I thought that was a little odd. I thought that was weird. We moved bipartisan legislation out of this subcommittee, And just as we're considering it, and it might be bad for big tech, the speaker's spouse goes and buys all this big tech stock, and then lo and behold, here we are with the bills not called up. And it just makes you wonder, did somebody know something? Was somebody acting on information? And it could have been the power of the lobbyists and all the money that they donate to members of Congress on both sides. It could have been people like Tim Cook calling, but here's what we know. These bills aren't coming to the floor. If they were coming to the floor, they would have been on the floor in prior weeks. And so now we sit here with this great work likely extinguished in its tracks for one of these unfortunate reasons. And Mr. Chairman, I know we've got Chairman Nadler's MORE Act coming up soon. And one thing we learned in the marijuana movement is sometimes you got to lose votes on the floor. Sometimes you got to put up the votes, you got to lose, and then year after year, you make a little progress, you get further down the road. And even if these tech bills can't pass, I would encourage you to talk to the speaker and put them up for a vote. And I know she said she won't put up votes that don't pass, but if it could at least give us a measuring tool to be able to come back and work to persuade our other members. I thank the chairman for his indulgence for going over time, and I yield back.
And I want to reassure the gentleman that I am working very closely with the ranking member of the subcommittee to be sure that our colleagues who have not had the benefit of the 16-month study that we conducted, where we, I think, learned a lot about this marketplace, understood what these complicated bills do. We want to be sure that our colleagues are fully briefed up, and we are committed to making certain these bills come to the floor, not just for a vote, but for a vote that prevails because of the hard work that's been done. And we are grateful for your ongoing and strong support. But this is an important priority for me. I know for all the Democrats in our caucus, and certainly for the chair of the full Judiciary Committee, and working very closely with Mr. Buck to be sure we get to that point. And thank you again for your support of our investigation and the legislation. And with that, I now go to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.